All right, I think what we'll do is we'll just get started, Phil. And so I'll just do a quick introduction for people. There's a couple of new people, well, people who haven't been to the webinars for a while. This is probably our third now webinar for Farming Forecaster for the East Coast and the Fingal. So most of the sites in this region have been established for a while. We've got two new sites that just come on board. One is Lewis Hill in Royal George in Fingal, and the other is Brockley Estate down at Buckland. So we are going to talk about what we're seeing at the different sites, what the forecast is. So Phil will give us a bit of a rundown here, and he'll also do a bit of a comparison between the two options to look at the forecast, which is the historic weather conditions and the long-range forecast for BOM. We'll also probably, I think, Phil, you're going to do a little bit of a refresher as well. So that's great. We've got Marek as well. Marek from AgLogic. So he's been working with us to get the probe networks established. The probes are one of the key components of the tool. So yeah, if you've got any questions about the soil probes, Marek can answer those. Phil will give us a rundown of the probes and the model, but Marek is available to give us a bit more detail about one or two of the probe sites. So I think we'll hand over to you, Phil, to get going. Before we do, any questions, feel free to put your hand up, raise your hand, or just interrupt. Please do if you've got any questions, or put messages in the chat, but there'll be plenty of opportunity for questions. So over to you, Phil.
Right, Tim, if you could get my presentation up.
I will.
Otherwise, we're
in the dark.
We're looking at faces, which isn't going to make much advantage for people.
No.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just going to run through some of the key things for this Radio Tim. Next one. East Coast and Fingal, and this time we're going to start in the Fingal. First thing I thought I'd put up is one of the things you've got in Farming Forecaster is a map of Tasmania. So I've just taken a screenshot, which includes the sites we're talking about tonight. The Gala site is covered by the Milton site, but the Gala site would have an 80% figure there. So what are the percentage figures in the boxes, in the circles? That's an indication of how much of the available soil moisture that plants can access is in the soil at this time in the top 60 centimetres. So if we go up to the top left-hand corner of the box, we'll see the sites at Perth and out at Clune, 199. They've copped that recent rain event that's come through. Campbelltown's at 87. Then we come down to the East Coast, and obviously those numbers are looking a hell of a lot better than they were 3 weeks ago. Tim and I were talking about what we should do, and we were starting to talk about doing totally different sort of presentation to what we've got tonight. If they're green, it's because there's more than 75% moisture. If moisture's between 25 and 75, and they're brown, and there's only one site which is in the red, which is on the western end of the Fingal Valley, which again has missed events, but that is historically much like that site. So anyhow, that's a picture. If we went up to Flinders Island, which we did yesterday, they're sitting up in the 90s as well. Thanks, Tim. If you go onto the site and you scroll down a bit, this is, I'm showing you if you like, the bottom half of the front page when you first go on. The reason I wanted to highlight this is there's three very important buttons. So what I just showed you was the regional map. So if you look on the big round red circle on the left-hand side below the weather, you can see two blue dots there. One says regional map, which is what we just looked at. And the one next to it is more probe details. So if you click on that more probe details, you get a lot more information, soil temperature, you get graphs of what's happened with the probes. Because these Fingal and East Coast probes have been in the ground for a number of years now, you actually compare this year's soil moisture to last year's soil moisture. I know producers in New South Wales have found that very useful. And then there's the other button up underneath the pasture growth rate, says more pasture details. You click on that, you get a lot more information about pasture, ground cover, soil moisture, some animal details. And also in the bottom left-hand corner is the weather forecast. There's a whole block of data there, very similar to what you can get off BOM through Medeye. The reason it's there, when the site was being developed, the producers were very strong in the view that they wanted everything on one site. So rather than having to go to another site to look up the weather, it sits there. And again, underneath that, there'll be a more weather detail button. If you click on that, you'll get a forecast that goes out for 7 days in 3-hour time slots. So just important that you realise that those, all you get initially is a summary on the front screen, but there's a lot more information sitting underneath. Next, please. One very important thing is whenever you look at this site, you need to check when it was last updated. So this is in fact just one of the sites off Flinders Island, but you'll notice where I've got the red circle under the probe and weather station. Whenever you go in, it will tell you when the information was last updated. So on this particular, there's no day mentioned there. So that means that the data was updated. The probe was updated 34 minutes before I went in, and the weather station was updated 19 minutes before I went in. If it was updated on a different day, it would actually start mentioning the day. Now, you know, we do have some issues with the site, and we have had some issues with the site in the first part of July. So it's always important that you go in and, well, when you go in, look up the top just to make sure of when the scenario was updated. The same applies to the information on the pasture side. Next one, please, Tim. We wouldn't believe this, but my screen has just gone totally blank and I can't see a thing. Tim, could you tell me what have we got up on the screen at present?
So what's happening now is we've got the slide that says learn to use farming forecasters. That's just a prompt about the videos.
Right. Yeah, rightio. There's very, very good training. I've got some screen back again. There's very good training videos on how to understand this site. They might go for 5 or 10 minutes. There's about 8 of them. They break up different sections. So for those of you who are new to it, and even those of you who've used it before, it's well worth going in there and getting a good understanding of what the information is telling you. It's going to give you a lot more information than I can in a short period of time. Next one, please, Tim. Rightio. So we're now on the pasture forecast side. Whenever you see shaded information on this site, it's information that's made up from historical data. So we use the GrassGrow program to generate the pasture forecasts. And the great strength of the GrassGrow is that we can download weather files over an extended period and therefore run a farm system which we've developed in conjunction with the producers over an extended period of time. So when I download a weather file, I'll download it from the 1st of January 1980 through to the current date, and I run it for all that time. And then I go and extract the data that sits from the year 1st of January 1993 to the end of December 2022. And that's what you're looking at there with that shaded data. Over those 30 years, you've had good years, you've had average years, and you've had terrible years. And that's the variation in green feed that this farm system has experienced over the last 30 years. The reason we do that is it gives you a reference point about how you're going compared to what you've experienced previously. Now, this will never mimic the farms we've set it up from. It's just not possible. Farms have a lot more flexibility. They haven't got one soil type. They haven't got one pasture type. You vary your sale dates between years, you vary stocking rates. But it's giving a robust view of what's going on. And what I just want to highlight is so shortly we're going to look at the forecast lines, which are those 10, 25, 50, 75 and 90% boxes above. I just want you to be very clear where if you like, the historical relative to those sit. So that the 10% where that's pointing to the arrow, that's, if you follow where the white meets the red, that's the 10% historical line. So in 10% of years over the last 30 years, green pasture has been less than that. The 25% is where the red hits the brown. So if you like, in a quarter of those 30 years, green pasture's been less than that line. Where the brown hits the green, that's the 50-50. 15% of years green pasture in the paddock was better than that line, and 15 years it was less than that line, and the top of the green is the 90%. And we've most likely experienced some of those in the last couple of years. So it's just important that you understand where they sit, because one of the key things once we bring the lines up is that you're comparing the coloured line, against its historical cousin or relative, if you'd like. Next, please, Tim. Now, this looks like a spaghetti graph. This is an example. How do we generate these forecast lines? We run the program up until a point in time. Now, this is just an example I've done. So I've run this up to the 20th. I've, in fact, run the program up to the 19th of June, and that's been based on actual weather data that has been generated for that site. So this is a site in Tassie. I don't actually know which one. It's a site in Tassie. Doesn't matter. So I've run it up to the 19th of June with actual weather data that I've been able to download. So at the end of that day, the program knows how much green feed's in the paddock, how much dead feed, what's the soil moisture, what are the animals, how much they weigh. It stores about 100 pieces of information. And then what we do is we tell the program to go and grab the daily weather data for this locality from 1993, from the 20th of June, and I've run through to the end of August. So from the 20th of June to the end of August from 1993, and if you look at that blue dotted line, from that starting point, if you got the weather from in 1993, you follow that blue dotted line. That's what the pasture graph would have looked like. And let's go and look at this, the standout. If you got the weather from 207 and you follow the red solid line, that's what pasture would have done. And there's all those there's 9 there, and you see this mishmash of potential pasture outcomes. Now, to generate the forecast we're going to look at in a minute, we run 30 of those. We take the data from 1993 through to 2022. So if you think about that period of time, you've experienced very good years, you've experienced average years, and you've experienced lousy years. So it gives us a snapshot of what is possible given the starting point that is reality in this year. So that's what's called a tactical run or seasonal forecast, and that's how we do it. We use 30 years of data, weather data that has occurred at that location. So there's 36 or 37 sites in Tassie at present. Each one of those has got a different weather file because they're all geographically different. All of Australia is split up into these 5 kilometre square grids, and we grab the weather data out of that 5K grid. So there is every site has a different weather system. Thanks, Tim. Now, again, back to one of the Tassie sites. we're going to go through each of the sites in the Fingal and East Coast after this. The black line tells us on the left-hand side, tells us what happened in the month of June. So at this site during the month of June, things got a bit better. So if you looked at where the black line started off, it was really starting off at about an average herbage mass level. And during the month, it moved in a positive direction. So it moved up and it moved in green. If you're sitting in green territory, you can feel comfortable. Now, we then see the three coloured lines. Now, I've just highlighted the 10, the 25 and 50. You can see on the top right, they're the ones that got ticks. Often when I look at this, I'm more interested in the bottom three than the top two. So there's two things we always look at. First thing, where are the lines sitting compared to history? So the starting point is in the green, and those lines continue in the green for at least 2.5, 3 months. So that's a real positive. We're in good territory, and the forecast is staying in that good territory. So the bold red arrows are comparing the forecast lines against their relatives. So you can see the red line is sitting well above. The 10% forecast line is sitting well above the 10% historical line. The 25% forecast is sitting well above the 25% historical, and likewise for the 50-50. The other thing you should look at is how much do those lines separate? And really, for July and August, it's only towards the end of August the lines start separating a bit, and they don't separate that much. So look at where it sits versus history, and look at how much the lines spread. The closer the lines stay together, the less risk to your system, because it means the red line is the red line is an exceptionally dry weather event for 2 months. If you followed along that red line, you are experiencing some of the driest rainfall events that you have experienced for 2 months, and it's not causing much difference in herbage mass. Now, why? Because we're in winter and growth rate's a bit slower. But it's also because we've got moisture in the ground. Moisture in the soil is water in the bank, and that's a buffer against rainfall. Once we get to spring, we see the lines start separating because suddenly pasture is increasing in growth rate, and we suck through moisture very quickly when that happens. Next one, please, Tim. Rightio. Now we're starting to look at the sites, and we'll start in the Fingal Valley, and we'll move down the east coast. So we're at Benham. You'll be able to read the name up the top. The left-hand side graph is climatology. Tim, could you just highlight the button? Climatology, and the right-hand one is access. Tuck across there with the arrow. So you click which one you want to look at. Climatology is where we use the last 30 years historical data, as I showed you with that spaghetti graph. Access is where we use 33 runs of forecast weather generated by the Bureau, BOM. Access is the name of their program that they use to generate seasonal forecasts. So the climatology is based on historical weather you have experienced in your environment. The right-hand side is forecast weather, again for your 5K grid. So the 33 runs in each of these sites are going to be slightly different because they're generated, each 5K grid around Australia gets a separate set of data. They shouldn't vary much, but there will be some. So that's the difference. The right-hand side or access is a forecast. The left-hand side of climatology is based on historical data. Now, do I place more emphasis on one or the other? I don't. I look at both and see what variation is occurring. Now, I'll let you just look at yourself. I'd maybe just focus on the green line. the 75%. Climatology, it's shooting up. In the access, it's dropping off. If we come down to the 50% in access, it's dropping off a bit. So the access, and considering all the publicity that's been about El Nino, remember, it's this access program which generates the data on which the BOM will make comments about El Nino or any other event. El Nino is only part of the story. Sometimes its emphasis gets overrated, and that's the important thing to bear in mind, that the impact of El Nino across Australia varies enormously. If we were all sitting in central Queensland, we would be a lot more concerned with what is occurring in the Pacific. I'm sitting in Yass on the southwest slopes, you're sitting in Tassie, and the impacts vary. The worst drought we've had in the Yass district did not occur in El Nino year. The red line hasn't varied that much, and in fact, some people would argue if you look at the access side, the red line looks better. Yeah, there's a little bit there, but I don't place too much in that. I'm looking for major changes, and about the major change I see there is the access is saying we're not going to have the wet end of spring. Yeah, fine, and to some degree, having a average spring or a slightly below average spring is not a negative. Sometimes some of our most profitable years come from those events. I'm not seeing anything there which I'd regard as worrying for me. You know, if you look at the 50% line on the access side, at the end of the graph, it's finishing still above the 50% historical line. But look how high it's bending over. Remember, this is a graph of green. If the green drops off, it's because it's moving from the green pool to the dead pool. So it's not that your property's becoming bare and that line drops substantially. It's because the amount of dead food is increasing. And look at the height of where the season's has bent over. It's bent over at very high levels compared to historical values. So I'm not going to talk about in as much detail with each of them, but that's the sort of thing you want to look at. Next, please. Lewis Hill. Quite frankly, the difference between these two is very minor. You know, the red line drops off a bit, but look at where it's sitting. It drops off and it's still in the green. That's a really, you feel really relaxed about that. I don't think I can say any more. And the one thing you always got to remember, on the 1st of August, these forecast lines are redone. So at the 1st of August, we'll have an opportunity to look at how October's performing again. And the closer you get to the month, the more reliable it comes. So the error bars are biggest 4 months out. The error bars are smallest 1 month out. So at the end of August, at the start of August, we'll get a graph for August, September, October, November. So in August, we'll be a bit more confident about what's happening in October because it's a closer period. That's all plus. Thanks, Tim. Speyside and what would I say? I'd say ditto to my comments at the last one. We're starting off at very high levels, and I think the last time we had a webinar, the comments from Mackenzie's was that you know that the actual situation was better than what the farming forecast is saying. At present, farming forecast is saying now it's a pretty good season. And if we look ahead, when you're starting from a high base like that, it's setting up pretty well. It's all positive. Thank you. Killymoon, again, starting off from a very good point. On both sides, on the access side, I suppose it's a bit of a message here in that the spring might start a bit earlier. But again, I point out, if you concentrate on that red one, it looks pretty dramatic how quickly it drops, but it's dropping off a very high point. compare at the start of October, compared where the red line is compared to where its historical cousin is sitting right down the bottom where the white meets the red, where if the season cuts off early, but it cuts off from a high base, you're still travelling in pretty good territory. So, of the 4 sites we've looked at in the Fingal, the first one was the one that's maybe the least comfortable, but that's also coming off the site which is the driest, so it hasn't got as much soil moisture in the ground, which is the buffer. These other ones were all green and then over 75%. Thank you. Rightio, now down on the east coast. This is a native site at Gala. Look, it's again, you go back to the basics. Where is it sitting? It's sitting in the green territory. Do the lines vary radically? For the first couple of months, they don't. And when they do drop off, they're still dropping off into if we look at where the red line starts bending over about the start of September, where Tim's got the cursor. It's bending over from a very high value. So that means the amount of dry food that's going on is pretty substantial. So while the shape of the graph looks different, this being a native site, less productive, so everything's been pushed down, but the underlying story is no different to what we've seen at the last 3 sites in the Fingal Valley. And there's very little difference. And it's a common thing about access at a lot of Tasmanian sites is you look at it and you say, well, often the red line seems to be a little bit better. Now, at sites that get waterlogging, a slightly drier situation can lead to slightly better pasture growth. So the program takes account of waterlogging. So sometimes that red line is kicked up because the waterlogging isn't quite as bad as it might have been over on the left-hand side. So therefore, pastures grow a bit better in that August period. Next, please. Milton. I suppose the major difference here, again, starting point's fine, lines stay close together. With the access, we haven't quite got the peak of growth in the green and the yellow lines. They're the ones that have been flattened more than the red line hasn't changed much. The other ones have come down. But you know, if an above average spring isn't quite as good, in a lot of cases, that's the plus, it's not a minus. So don't think that we've always got to be way up the top and over the top. You know, quite frankly, in the gas environment at present, the best thing that we could have would be an average spring and a hot, dry summer, because that would give us a chance to really get on top of worms, which have just been smashing us for the last 3 years. So an average year can be a very productive year. That's an important thing that we realise. Thanks. Next one down the coast, a really similar trend to what we just saw at Milton. It's really the red and green lines which get flattened a bit by access. Now this was a drier site to start off with. So if we look at the black tracking line in the month of June, at the start of June, things were getting pretty tight down this way. But that beautiful rain event came at maybe about the 20th. And we can see the black line kicked up, and that's put moisture in the ground, and we've got this very strong upward production line. So that's the value of that rainfall event, filling your soils up again. It's driving the early part of spring production for you, and then you're looking at spring rainfall to push it on. If we look at the climatology side, and if it's the drier end, it'll follow a path which you would have seen a number of times before, but the red line is only getting down to the sort of the 25% line, and look how high the herbage mass was at about the start of September when things started to bend over. It's coming off a much higher value than you've seen in other difficult years. And again, I think it's fairly obvious from all the information's around. There's no way we should be thinking we're going to get a wet year, but an average year is still putting us in pretty good territory. Thanks, Tim, and I might get Marek to take over for this slide, because this is actually the probe of Kelvedon, which has got some really interesting information which I think we should talk about. Thanks, Marek. You're on mute, mate.
Thanks, Phil. Yeah, no, this is this site is a classic example of the soils that are really typical down through the east coast, those cracking clays, and this one so much so that it's when I'm just going to open the graph up. So when it this probe in the summer, it's poking the top of the probes. Like I installed it probably 5 centimeters under the ground, and that's when I installed it. And in the summer, it dries out so much so that that it takes the top of the probe out of the ground. So it shows that soils like that don't just shrink across it; they shrink up and down as well. So that you're talking about much over 120 centimeter profile. So so I've been to look at it back in when it's been wet and it's disappeared again, and in the summer it's poked its head back up. So it's quite an interesting one. But what I might do, I might just share my screen. Just take over for a sec, Tim, and show you what makes this quite interesting. Can you see that screen now? So we can see here that as we're coming through in March and April, so that
Barry, I can't see it. I don't know if anyone else can.
Can you see it, Tim?
I can see it. Can everybody else?
Yep, fantastic. Sorry, you have to miss out for this one, Phil. You know what we're talking about though anyway.
That's okay.
So when we're coming through, so we're seeing a nice typical, so we are coming out of summer. It was a beautiful spring through the east coast, as it was through much of Tasmania. We can see here that we're coming out, we're drawing moisture. Got a nice rainfall event here, which topped it up nicely, and again through here. So it's behaving like a typical soil. It hasn't dried out too much. But once we're at a prolonged period, February through to mid-March, we can see that we've had a bit of a rainfall. And what happens is you can see how from 10 centimetres down to 60 centimetres, that's been almost completely bypassed with the water that's gone down the profile. But what it has done is hit this 80 and 70 centimetres. Now, there's no coincidence that that's where these lines have jumped. As we can see here, we never actually there was never any root activity at past 90 centimetres. We had a little bit at 80, so we were drawing some moisture down to 80 centimetres and 70 centimetres. So as that soil went down, it didn't go down evenly through the profile. What it did, it found a crack or a bit of preferential flow, which is very common and typical with these kind of cracking clays. It went down to about 80 to 90 centimetres, 80 centimetres, where cracks have closed because the moisture hasn't been drawn out of the soil at this point in time. And so what it does, it fills back up. So instead of filling from the top down uniformly, as we expect the soil would, or have been taught at university or at college, it's that textbook soil water movement. This just shows that it's the inverse of that. So instead of filling from the top down, it's filling from the bottom up. So again, you look at a rainfall event in mid-March and you go, well, how valuable is that to us in terms of pasture growth? So if the pasture growth is really driven by the top 60 centimetres, what does this soil moisture mean to us? Is it just keeping the pasture going so it can kick off again come spring this year? Or is it just making sure we don't that pasture doesn't die and just maintaining it? So as you can see here, that next bit of rainfall again, a little bit, you can see, so that water does, as it goes down the cracks, it does dissipate sideways through the cracks into the surrounding soil matrix. So you can see we've had a bit more of a response that next rainfall we've had, but again, predominantly through here, but then it has a bigger response in that 60 centimetres. And then again, similar, you can see another larger response through, so that dissipation of the soil through the matrix from the crack has wetted up a little bit, so that infiltration into the side of the soil bed inside of it has been increased through that breakdown of that tension that is caused by drying soil. And again, you can see that 60 centimetres is almost filled back up to where it was here, well, pretty much has filled up where it was here, and then that 50 centimetre takes over. And then we had that beautiful rainfall that came in late June that just really topped everything up, particularly through the east coast, and that's just gone and filled that right back up to where we want it to be. So yeah, Phil's highlighted that this is just a beautiful illustration about how the soils, particularly in this part of the world, through the east coast with those vertic cracking clays, how they just behave inversely of how we think soils should behave. So when we see that rainfall come and it just disappears, it's not wasted, it's doing something. It's just what this soil here, this is really just, but this is helping with this winter recharge that we kind of saw here in mid to late June. So yeah, no, beautiful soil top there. Phil, so yeah, you want to take back over there, Tim?
Thanks, Marek.
Thanks, Marek.
I think that's one of the things we've learned from the 3 or 4 years or longer we've had probes up in New South Wales, is that people are understanding about how their soils behave. And if I look at 50k around where I live, we've got some soils that will behave in the classic way. That is, they'll fill from the top down. Some of the very free draining granites will be the other way. They'll go to the bottom and then it'll come back up. And if we look at now where that probe is at present, and that would be information that I downloaded yesterday, in the 10 and 20 centimetre, we're still at 30%. So the perennial grasses have got their roots down into good moisture. They'd be going really well. But annuals which have just germinated, they're gonna struggle a bit. And if you think that 33 and 35 has only occurred very recently, so obviously I'm not there, but if I walked into that pasture, I'd expect maybe not to see much clover, not much annual, a lot of perennial, because the perennial roots are in deep moisture and they've been going for a while, and there's still maybe not enough moisture in that topsoil really to drive annual growth. So as Marek said, the perennial roots are there to depth. Some of that at very deep, that's about survival moisture. But certainly when we get up in the 60, 50 and 40 centimetres, that's moisture that will be driving perennial growth. But that's not doing anything for annuals which have just germinated and their roots might only be 10 or 15 centimetres. They're having to deal with the top, and at 33% of moisture, they can get moisture, but they're not getting it easy. They've got to work hard, so that's going to have an impact on growth. But it's just a really good example, and the other thing you might notice over time is that you might find a band that doesn't seem to do much. I think in one site we've looked at for years, it's at about 40 centimetres. There's a band of soil that basically holds no moisture. There's moisture held above and there's moisture held below, but in that 40 centimetre band, it just holds nothing. We just got this band of soil which really is just filling airspace. So looking at probes and how they behave with rainfall events just informs you a bit more about how your soils are behaving, but how the soil moisture in your soil is behaving. And it's the soil moisture in your soil which has got a huge impact on plant production, especially up in the top level. Thanks. Rightio, back on to looking at the seasonal forecasts. Again, at this site, we see the same, looking at the black line over on the left-hand side. that boomerang shape as the people in this area, the East Coast, were going through June. I don't think they were terribly happy, and I think there were frowns developing on the foreheads. And then the rain came and it's boomeranged, and again the same thing, great soil moisture. So the system is has the capacity to respond. It is responding into really good territory. Again, very similar. It's the green and yellow lines, the 75 and 50%, which are the ones that have most likely been impacted most over on the access graph. Again, same story. Don't expect we're going to have a big wet spring. I've talked about that. We won't go on about it. Next one, thanks, Tim. And Brockley Estate, the last one, certainly was not impacted in June. Picked up rainfall earlier in autumn, so we've got a totally different starting point compared to the last two East Coast sites. Now, the one thing I would mention, thanks, Tim, you'll notice and apologies, I in fact forgot to, it was only late today that I realised I'd missed it out. So I've downloaded this Brockley data this afternoon, and the difference you will notice between this one and all the other ones is that the black line has in fact started pushing out into the month of July. Now, there was a glitch at Cyro in Hobart this month. I'm not quite sure why, but it happened. So that should have happened on about the 8th or 9th of the month. That only appeared today. So that black tracking line is telling us on all the other ones, the black tracking line ended at the start of July. Every 7 days, the black tracking line should be redrawn to give us an indication of how we're performing during the month. Those coloured lines are drawn on the 1st of the month, and that is it. The black tracking line that tells us how we're performing during the month. So because the lines are so close together, but you'd have to say it's tracking along maybe the green or the red, the yellow. It's certainly not tracking along the red. So that as you go through the month, every 7 days that black tracking line should be extended. So it's giving you an idea which of those forecast lines are we moving along. In terms of what this seasonal forecast says, this side is starting off from very good territory, and it doesn't matter which side, whether you look at the left-hand side or the right-hand side, it's just giving you a very positive response. And this is the last graph. So maybe just in summary, at none of the sites really am I seeing something which I'd regard as worrying in terms of where season's going. Again, on the 1st of August, the lines are redrawn. So on the 1st of August, it'll be the moisture in the ground. On the 1st of August, it becomes a starting point. Herbage mass on the 1st of August is the starting point, and then we take the forecast, either be climatology or access out. I'll keep watching as we go through, as each month gets added, whether this access is starting to become more negative than what it is at present. But it's my view is provided I get a spring, I don't really care what happens after that. So, as I said, I can see some value in all our systems if we get a slightly drier summer than what we've had, provided we've got a spring. An average spring gives us better pasture quality when it dries off. So therefore stock performance is a lot better. Everyone in Eastern Australia suffered over the last couple of years with poor live weight gain in lambs, ewes, cattle, just because big seasons we get low pasture quality. Average seasons we get high pasture quality. So while we might have a bit less pasture on the system, we get better weight gain, and we might in fact get rid of stock quicker in an average year than we do in a big season. Tim, I'll stop there and we'll open up for questions.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, it's good to have a look at it was good to have a bit of a deep dive onto one of the probes, and I think that's a really good sort of look at how soils behave, because it's really interesting how we have this perception that soils always sort of fill up from the top down. So that was a really good summary from both of you. Thank you. So these probes will give us some information about soil moisture levels, but they also give us an insight into how those soils behave. So that's really useful. So I might open it up to questions from everybody. Please let us know if you've got any for both Marek and Phil. No questions? You're all pretty okay with what we've presented. I hope it's been very useful to you.
Tim, could
Yep.
I just interrupt? I was
Yep.
just thinking, if we go back to the we haven't got it, but don't show it. But if we go back, if you look at the Benham site, it's the exact opposite of what we talked about on the Kelvedon site. You know, the only two segments of that soil, there we go. It's the 10 and the 20 that have got moisture in them, and underneath has got virtually nothing. So at that site, those topsoils are grabbing the moisture and holding onto it, and it's not till they fill up that only then will moisture start moving down through the profile. So you've got two localities, and people can look at the Benham site later, Tim. But there you got two localities in Tassie that are behaving in the totally opposite direction, and you can see it. You go to Benham, and there's no moisture down low; it's all up top. And if we look at the Kelvedon site, down low's full, and it's the top that's a bit dry at present. So there's just two examples of how soils are filling in different ways.
Yeah. All right. Unless we've got any other questions, just like to say thank you to Phil and Marek for presenting. Yeah, we'll have another seasonal update in the next few months, and if you've got any questions about today, please let us know after the session. Happy to answer them. Yeah, I hope we found it very useful. And we'll be talking a little bit more. I'm going to be actually presenting at the Red Meat updates in a month or so, a few weeks. So if you're there, you'll see me at the Red Meat updates talking about Farming Forecaster. So, yep. Okay, so thank you, everybody, and we'll catch you soon.
Bye all.
Cheers.
Thanks, Tim. Thank you.
No worries. Cheers.
Thanks, fellas.
Cheers.